Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We've got Richard Shimooka with us tonight. He's a senior research fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and he's an expert on NATO, defense issues, geopolitical issues, etc. He's a defense and foreign policy research analyst. He's got a long history of applying his skills to study complex social, organizational issues. He speaks frequently in media, and he's written some really interesting columns and op-eds that I have the pleasure of reading on a regular basis. We're going to talk tonight about Canada's role in the world. We're going to talk about NATO. We're going to talk about defense spending. We're going to talk about the U.S. We're going to talk about Trump. We're going to talk about Ukraine. It's going to be a really interesting conversation. Richard Shimooka, welcome to the show, sir.
Thanks for having me.
So are we living in a far scarier world today than we were 6 months ago?
Oh, absolutely. I think that everybody had a bit of an inkling that Donald Trump could win. And as we came closer to the November elections, the sort of fears grew. But the speed at which Trump has kind of made his changes over the past, just his first month of being in office, has really surprised, I think, almost every single observer in this area of foreign relations or American foreign policy or American government. And right now, looking what's going on in Ukraine, what's going on in the Middle East, it's really I think there's a feeling that we're kind of bit on a precipice, and where we may go from here is not at all clear.
So are there historical analogies to where we are between the United States and Ukraine? You mentioned before we started similarities to the negotiated withdrawal from Afghanistan, which was just like throw in the towel and leave as quickly as possible, in my sense. Or is this Neville Chamberlain going to Munich and giving up half of Czechoslovakia or whatever? Or is this Yalta and carving the world into different spheres? What's your sense? Are there any historical analogies to where we are?
I gotta be honest, I've always really been careful about the historical analogies I used, but the 1930s, when you had a international system that was very sort of weak, uncertain, unstable, looking at the way that Ukraine's sovereignty has kind of been bandied about by the Trump administration as a negotiating ploy. The statements made about Zelensky really brings the 1938 kind of parallels to the fore. I think Europeans and Canadians really need to sort of understand the moment that we're in, is that the United States does not, under Trump's administration, does not seem at all willing to play the role that it has essentially since 1941, where they're the ultimate guarantor of the international system, the stability, the economic order that really has maintained our security and prosperity, and need to, at least for the next 4 years, step up to some degree and take control of their own destiny. Because if we remember the 1930s, when the United States wasn't an isolationist power, it allowed various smaller powers to sort of take greater and greater role, and you see the rise of Nazi Germany, our fascist states, and it's a scary, scary time.
I don't know my history as well as I probably should, and you're probably an expert on it, but my remembering of some of the stories that I read and the histories I read is that Neville Chamberlain was actually congratulated for a good year plus after he went to Munich and gave in to Nazi demands. And there was almost a lone voice within the Conservative Party in the UK, and that was Winston Churchill, that was saying it was a mistake. But the balance of his party actually was very supportive of him, and no one thought that Nazi Germany, Hitler, would do anything until September 1st, 1939, when they actually attacked Poland. And that's when they were caught off guard, and very quickly they changed their attitude. So for a while, the politics were supportive of what Neville Chamberlain did. Is that correct?
To some degree, I think, especially you saw a lot of that in France. Daladier sort of was seen as a hero and was cheered as well. And I think privately, it's now clear that within the French government, they thought that this was not going to go well. I think I believe it's Daladier, somebody upon seeing these cheering clouds says called them idiots and said they don't know what they're cheering about because we've just sold out our some of our strategic position. What I really find the parallel I find interesting between then and now is that the politics of their day and our day was very much broken up. And you had various parties and factions that weren't clear about some of these choices and were pushing for some not great strategic choices, not to fund rearmament quick enough, not to be strong enough against these rising powers and prepare for the situation they faced in. And there were groups that certainly were very pro rearmament or were strong in security on both sides on major powers, but the sort of the messiness of their politics of their day really didn't allow the focus that was required that you would see just 2 years later when they are fighting the war and you have that sort of unity effort that didn't exist in 38 and 37 36 and that allowed a lot of these fascist powers to sort of rise and grow and grow in their strength. So I think that is one of the parallels is that politics that just kind of allowed a lot of this growth to occur early on when it may have been easier to stop that rise. And just the other side is that if you think about the loss of Czechoslovakia, people think that Hitler was emboldened by it. Well, sure, he was always emboldened by it, but Czechoslovakia was a huge manufacturing power in the 1930s, and it really supercharged the German economy to allow it to fight the war in the coming years. So those are some of the parallels that I see when it comes to that age, and especially with the weakness of politics at that time.
Yeah, and I guess the parallel that I was trying to draw out is that I think a lot of people think that people at the time saw appeasement as a mistake right away, but it took a year and a half for people to see that appeasement was a mistake. And in Britain, you had a former king that was supportive of the Nazis. In the United States, you had Charles Lindbergh and other people that were incredibly supportive of the Nazis, holding rallies in Madison Square Gardens in support of the Nazis. And so it took a while. For a while, it looked like Neville Chamberlain and appeasement was right, and peace in our time was possible until it wasn't. And so I worry that Trump might actually look good for a while.
I think I'd like to think, I wasn't in 38 there and sitting, on a curb and can observe, but I'd like to think there's a little bit better understanding of how bad this can go. American support for Putin or believe in it says something at 10%. And I think the Europeans, for the most part, have a fairly good understanding. I think the rise of the far right in Germany and in France is a concern, but there is still a pretty strong majority that expands a bunch of parties that understands that we cannot give in to Putin's demands. But whether or not across the 20-some nations of the European Union and Canada, can we fashion some sort of durable political effort to play an alternate role instead of the United States in this negotiations and sort of conflict with Putin? I don't know. That's tough. That's not easy. That doesn't really exist. The European Union wasn't well designed in the past 3 decades since they talked about foreign policy to sort of deal with these kind of issues. And can they actually get past that? I don't know. They basically allowed the United States to play that role, since the 1940s, and it's not all clear where they can make that negotiation or provide that alternative to help Ukraine.
You don't think they can force it with the threat of withdrawing all of their military support?
It's tough to say. We're in uncharted territory, right? I'd like to think so, but you have a high representative for the European Union. Typically, that's not been they played a role, but it's not played a role in the extent that it's going to be necessary. And whether or not these countries are willing to sort of work together in a way beyond some of their a specific national interest, like where Macron, or if it's Schultz in Germany, maybe Merz, who's his likely replacement, can they come and play this role individually? I'm not sure. It's tough to say at this point in time.
But if I was in Latvia or Lithuania or Estonia today, Finland, I'd be a lot more worried about whether America would actually honor Article 5 of NATO and come to support me. And I'd be spending a lot more money on defense and getting together with my neighbors to try to make sure that they had a potential solution to any kind of Russian invasion.
And that's why you see the high spending members of the NATO alliance being Eastern Europeans. Poland is basically at 4% of GDP, and they are on a buying spree that is quite something else. They are buying military arms from Korea, South Korea, from the United States, from other EU states, wherever they can get it, they're buying it. You're seeing it basically enacting law in Czechia that they have to hit 2% of GDP now. Across the Baltics, all these states they are worried that not just the US is going to abandon them, but Western Europeans abandon, because again, if we're thinking about parallels to 1930s, they've seen this film before, right? And so they want to be as strong as possible to sort of confront any potential aggression if the unthinkable happens in Ukraine, it gets neutralized or falls or whatnot. So I think they are worried. They're really worried, and they're trying to build their own defenses, but also try to build some sort of durable alliance just in case the U.S. withdraws.
Well, I think where I want to move next is to what the implications are in Canada. And should we go immediately to 2% of GDP for defense spending? Let's take a break for some messages and come back in just 2 minutes with our expert on national security, on NATO, on defense, etc., talking about what Canada needs to do now. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I've got Richard Shimooka. He's a senior research fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute as my guest tonight. This guy's got quite a background. In addition to the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, he was a research fellow at the Conference for Defense Associations. He was a deputy administrator with Wesnoth Inc. He was a research consultant. He's got a research fellow in Defense Management Studies program from Queen's University, a visiting fellow of international relations, et cetera, et cetera. This man knows what he's talking about in regards to national defense and geopolitical security issues. So I got to ask you, if I was sitting in Ottawa, given what's going on, I'd go to 2% of GDP spending on national defense tomorrow. Like, what's going on in Ottawa?
Well, that's a question. Well, right now what's going on, as you well know, is that we are likely looking down the barrel of an election. Likely sometime in May. And
but we're announcing billions of dollars on fast rails. We're sending out checks.
Yeah,
we've got an issue where we could depend on the United States previously. We're now faced with a situation where the United States is saying we're the 51st state and they're going to use economic coercion to take us over. Why aren't we spending the 2% of GDP on defense? Like, what's the argument against that?
I would argue that basically we actually probably need a white paper, a new one, right? Defense spending is difficult in the sense that it is heavily programmed. It takes years in some cases to actually get the money out the door. There are ways to do it quicker, right? But a large portion of the I'll give you an example. If you were to buy, let's say, a new drone, right, you need to put together a request for proposal. You need to know what you want to buy. So what's the mission that we're looking at? Is it going to be light, heavy? How long does endurance it has? Then you got to identify who's going to fly the system, how it's going to maintain. You're going to have basically a RFP to have a competition, unless you exactly know what you want to buy. And that all takes years to unfold. And so this kind of process dance, even when cut down to the sort of quickest components, will take several years to actually unfold and implement. Now, if we were quote unquote in a war, it could happen maybe in a year, but it will take time, right? So this process in general will take years to sort of get this money out the door. There's some promises being made by some of the political leaders or potential political leaders or candidates who are trying to say, well, we can do it in 2 to 3 years, possible, and we can get into that. But it does require a bit more effort than, let's say, any other department in government to actually shovel this money out the door and actually get some effect. And the other things, we have to be really careful what we spend our money on in defense. We can make some quick fixes, and there are areas where you can get that through, but there's real potential to do damage actually just by spending more money than you should, right? So it's a little bit more complex than I want to make a tax benefit for seniors above 65 or something like
Okay,
that,
so
right?
if
That's
if
really
if I appointed you Minister of Defense tomorrow, what would you do?
so if I wanted to hit 2%,
No,
probably.
I'm asking.
Oh,
It's what I think, but
hey,
I
well,
want you to tell me. You're the expert. What's the right decision? How quickly? How fast? Would you do it at all? Would you just reduce spending and spend it on healthcare? Tell me what you think as the expert on national security, knowing Canada's situation, knowing the threat or lack of threat from the United States. Because I don't know, is it real or is
yep.
it just is he just tweeting out?
Well, I'm personally believe that he's using a lot of this as bluster as negotiating tactics. So, but I do think clearly we need to spend more on defense. We need to have more options because on our defense policy, we've really just basically made ourselves part of Fortress North America through NORAD, and we've really not spent on our NORAD capabilities. So I'd like to see a refurbishment and modernization and expansion of some of these capabilities. And frankly, that's going to be significantly above 2%. And I think there's a growing realization within Ottawa among all parties that 2% is basically the foundation. It's the floor, and we probably need to spend significantly more of that to have an effective military because our actual military capability that we put out there is quite limited. Significantly less. We're getting a lot less defense bang for our buck, right? We are, despite this fact, if we spend 2%, we're not actually deploying what other people are getting for 2%. So if I was the minister, I think the very quick, easy fixes is to spend on two things. One is there's a lot of infrastructure within D&D that is really old, 60, 70 years in some cases. A lot of that money can be put out the door quickly, more base quarters for personnel, physical infrastructure, on cloud-based infrastructure, all this sort of stuff can be spent on quickly. Another one I would say is modernization of key capabilities. The Army really needs some new artillery, electronic warfare systems, that sort of stuff is really important. But one thing we really need that is desperately required is reform of how we actually administer Department of National Defense. And this is not really a sexy thing by any means, but certainly we buy things way too slowly. It takes far too much time. The cost increases are pretty significant over what they should cost because of the delays and the process that we take. I would look at real reform, and that means a lot of departments are going to have to give up their influence on defense procurement and try to streamline this as fast as possible. The last thing I would say is probably the only thing that we can right now quickly go and buy something that will make a big splash is probably submarines. And that means potentially looking at acquiring them through a sole source approach. We will have to pick without a competition. Navy really needs this submarines quickly because of the age of their current submarine fleet. And this would be a quick way to get to 2%, potentially before 2028 or 29 or something like that. So there are some ideas. It's a lot of reform, of the current system, buying some capabilities, putting some money into actually also buying more munitions, which can be done quickly. And clearly we're going to also a white paper that will capstone this all to reorganize how we think of our defense and where we go from here.
So I've heard comments about desperate need for icebreakers, that we're not protecting our north, the Arctic, the Northwest Passage, that China, US, Russia are doing a lot more on our Northwest Passage and in the Arctic than we are. Submarines also there. But we've also heard comments about, we've been talking about jets for a decade, and we're not doing anything. We've been hearing about ships, frigates, etc., and then just personnel. That there's more people in the CRA than there are in national defense. So tell me what you think some of the other priorities are.
Well, a lot of these programs, like the fighter program, which is delayed again, partly because of some issues that we're having with basically implementing basing and frigates are taking time, but these are big programs. Basically, the River class destroyer was going to be Canada's largest capital spending program probably since the 1940s. Even the James Bay hydroelectric programs in Quebec doesn't even come close to the money that we'll have to spend over time. Yeah, because
seriously, we're spending more on frigates than on James Bay.
Yeah, basically, if you're looking at some $90 billion with overall with the entire length of the program. Now you got to think that we're talking about just not buying the frigates, but also the operating costs over their lifetime. It's actually not that surprising. And this is basically the Navy's main capability that will basically protect our coastlines and be our sort of main tool that we go abroad with. So it's not that surprising over time. People think we're just buying it for no, it's actually we have to pay for their operation, their crews, the fuel that they use, their upgrades. So that is a big sense. So a lot of those programs, though, because of their complexity and their time and what we've done with them, it's we can't accelerate them easily. We can maybe move them up at 1 or 2 years, but it's not really a big movement. If we think about the again, as I said before, a lot of these things take a large amount of time to move. They're like big policy super tankers. And we can't easily change how many troops are within the Canadian forces in 1 or 2 years. We can kind of increase it, but a lot of these people won't be trained. And think about the future that we're facing, which is highly agile, technological sort of adversaries. We need people who are maybe in the system for 3, 4, 5 years, where we can train them, give them new sort of roles that deal with the sort of the threat environment, and that takes time to sort of build the training for them and get them into service and get them experience in those new roles. So personnel is one of those core areas, and in some ways there's a bit of a good news story coming out of the Department of National Defense that they're actually starting to hit their recruiting targets even before the 51st state. The current CDS Jean Carillon has made this her main priority, and you're starting to see some effort after years of not hitting the recruitment targets. They're actually meeting them. They will potentially meet them this year. So there is some positive area, and sort of building on those efforts, I think will really help, especially as we need to increase our forces size to deal with some of these threats.
Not to be alarmist, but 2 years and 11 months ago, no one thought that Putin was going to actually invade Ukraine. They said, he's talking, he's bluster. It's a whole bunch of threats, but he's not actually going to do anything. And then 3 years ago, he actually did. Or sorry, I apologize. 3 years and 2 months ago, no one thought that Putin would attack, but 3 years ago, he actually did. Given what's going on in the United States right now, you don't think we got to ramp up everything you just said?
We can. I mean, we should. I've been saying this for at least 10 years now, right? When we I don't want to make say that we can't, we shouldn't. I mean, I think there's always a really sort of naive approach to think that what we were spending, basically at 1%, maybe 1.2, and it bounced around 1.3 for the better part of a decade was a really foolish approach. During the first Trump administration, there were clear signs that he did not want to be, paying for NATO and being the sort of the guarantor of everybody's security. And sure, we were lucky that Biden came in and sort of made alliances a center point of his kind of his administration. But even then, our allies, I think about the Washington NATO conference last year, where our allies were all saying, and this happened every year before that, that you need to spend more. And this international security, the prosperity that you are benefiting from only is provided by, a common defense, and Canada just ignored that. So absolutely, we should spend more. Basically what I'm saying is that if we're going to spend more and want to get the best bang for our buck, it requires a lot of big policy steps. And again, a white paper is a big important part of it because it sets, what are we going to do with this money? Are we going to spend it on NATO capabilities? Are we going to keep spending on NORAD capabilities to defend North America? I would argue we need both. Like, as much as we are appalled by the statements that Donald Trump has made on our sovereignty, just giving up, just throwing up our hands, oh, we're just not going to spend on this, is also not really a great position, because there are real security threats from Russia and China in our on our territories. So I think that we're going to have to look at spending there. All I'm saying is just basically, if we're going to go down this path, we just need to organize this a bit better, sort it out. One of the big issues within the department is the capacity to actually execute on programs, i.e. the physical people who are going to say, I think we should buy this system, identify the requirements, who's going to identify how we're going to train, man, whatever. Doesn't exist, because those people, there's so few of them within the department that they can't actually make any decisions. They're running around trying to implement the decisions that they currently have, and you can't just layer on even more work because there's just nobody there to do so. And that's part of the problem why some of these programs, like the F-35, have been delayed over the past year here, is that just staff capacity just doesn't exist to execute. So it would be nice if we could spend it, right? Again, we can spend a lot on infrastructure and what we call national procurement, which is the munitions and whatnot, but the capacity to do so for anything beyond that isn't there. And the only program where I can see that staff capacity exists in a meaningful way to execute quickly is the submarine program. Beyond that, you need new people to be reorganized into this, and those people just don't exist. So
my grandfather and my great uncle during World War II were business executives in Montreal, and they were seconded dollar a year men to Ottawa to work with C.D. Howe, who I think was the Minister of Finance, to manage and administer the munitions effort and the war effort.
That's what it was. Minister of Defense Production.
Do we need something like that? Do we need to recruit business people, experienced at procurement, second them to the government, and put this government on maybe not a war effort, but on a on a 2% of GDP spending effort?
From your mouth to the Prime Minister's ears, because I've been long saying that. I think that one of the problems with our system of governance, it does not allow for, let's say, people with unique skill sets and knowledge to be easily brought into the system to implement these complex challenges. And if we think about the really difficult technological environment that we live in, people, business executives who have that understanding how to manage well and effectively in the private sector, I think we should bring these people in. We just can't. The system doesn't easily allow for that. We built a public service that is so driven by process that the conventions and the sort of conferencing that is required to make any decision on these issues, especially on defense procurement, where it's pretty bad, makes it difficult from outside. It would frustrate them endlessly to come into this environment and say, yeah, try to go buy a fighter or a ship or whatnot. It's just doesn't exist. And back then it was easier because government wasn't as developed or didn't have these processes. Now it's really difficult, and it doesn't also allow easily to bring them in. So I would love that to happen. I would love to have a reform of this area. And this goes back to the process reforms and reorganization in order to make defense procurement quicker. But we don't. And I look abroad, like the United States, and how they bring in, this is not to do with Elon Musk, but like in previous eras, it was quite common for business executives who have real talent to come in and help run these departments, and they did really effective work. We don't do that, and it's to our sort of unending, detriment that we don't allow this movement, because I think there is, you're right, in the public sector, in the private sector, there are people who can really help, but we don't use our talents at all.
I think we've got to put a huge effort comparable to what we did during the pandemic. This is a national emergency, and I think we need to address it comparable to the that kind of effort that the whole country came together on in regards to dealing with the pandemic. We're going to take a break and come back, and I want to turn back to Ukraine and Europe and what Richard thinks is actually going to happen there, because we've had some things that have shocked me, like demanding half of all your critical minerals. Like, where'd this come from? We're going to take a break and come back and ask our expert what's going on in Europe. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio, where we're focused on national defense, Ukraine, what's going on with NATO, etc., with Richard Shimooka, who is the Senior Research Fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. He's an expert on defense and foreign policy. Richard, this demanding critical minerals, is this today's version of Lend-Lease? Like, what's going on? I've never heard of us, supporting one of our allies with munitions and armaments and everything else, and then coming along and demanding that we get sold half of their resources.
I've never heard of it either. I think I think for many observers of international relations, they don't know where this is coming from. I think we have to be honest here. Donald Trump and his administration, Donald Trump doesn't think in the conventional terms, or the conventions of which that we have conceived of international relations for decades, right? And the demand for critical minerals as a bargaining chip to maintain support, I can't immediately think of a parallel right now that any country in the West has even attempted. So, but maybe in his mind that this is important, right? And this is the way that they're going to make some sort of condominium to sort of with Ukraine and Russia. It's shocking. I think you watching Zelensky say, okay, if I have to make a deal in this area in order to preserve my security, I guess I'll have to do that, right? That's all I got, right? But I think to many other, the Canadian government, the members of the European Union, they are pretty shocked by how this is what the United States wants.
I was at a dinner the other night where someone was comparing it to FDR's speech supporting Lend-Lease, and his comment about, when your neighbor's house is on fire, you lend them the hose. You don't ask to be paid for the hose and the water. And he said, well, this is like, I'm going to lend you the hose, but before I do, I want you to agree that you're going to give me the Porsche.
Yeah, but Lend-Lease was in some ways a political solution for a problem that he had, because he had isolations within his government and with the United States. And so this kind of got around some of the congressional laws that prevented the United States from effectively supporting Europe, or sorry, the United Kingdom. This is different in some ways. This is more like what you just this is exactly what you said, right?
In lots of ways.
Yeah. I mean, even FDR was trying to help, and it wasn't because he was doing it because he felt like, oh, you got to make a trade. It was more, no, I need a way to actually do this. If I don't do it this way, Congress is going to say no, right? So this is something else completely. And again, I think Zelensky feels like he's in such a position that he doesn't do this, he's just going to be cast adrift, kind of like Ashraf Ghani in Afghanistan in 2020. So I think that's maybe what he's saying. And he doesn't, I don't know if he trusts Europeans to step up and provide. They've been very they've been lukewarm, or they've been very equivocal about their actual support. I think he's watched how Germany's just not done very much. Has put the brakes on some of the efforts that other countries have kind of put forward in the European Union. So I think there's a real reticence within Ukraine to fully trust the Europeans as well.
So given your expertise in national security, defense, etc., what do you think is going to happen, and what do you think should happen in Ukraine?
I think what's come out in the past 24, well, sorry, I think what's come out past more of that, the past week here has really underlined that there's going to be some sort of group. I think Ukrainians are tired too. I mean, this has been a rough, brutal war. They've kind of understood that they're not going to get everything back. They're not getting Crimea back, unfortunately. You know, they may get parts of the South back, but it's tough to see. I think you will see an agreement in the next, may not happen the next week or two, or but it could come sometime. That will build an uneasy peace. The real question here is whether or not Ukraine will be allowed to arm fully, just maintain its sovereignty and its full ability, Kiev's ability to actually, or Kiev's ability to fully rearm. I think that's probably the big question, and whether or not they can remain in a strong alliance with the West. What should happen is, I think that we are actually giving Putin to some degree an out here that he doesn't deserve. And if had we kept going maybe for another 5 6 months, I think Ukraine would have been a much better part. If we continue to provide them arms and increase the production and provision of arms to them to allow them to fight, I think they've consistently asked for specific munitions that we've just not given them, long range precision missiles that would have allowed them to take the fight into Russia, which they already have been doing, but more effective than they have been, and just continually give them the assistance that they need to fight effectively. We've through this whole conflict just tied one hand behind their back and said, keep fighting, you know, gonna have to lose lives, but sorry, we can't give it. I think if we had given them some of these munitions earlier and some of these arms earlier, it really would have put the point at Russia that we are willing to support them. And frankly, Putin's strategy is always believe that this day would come, that the West would capitulate in some ways and offer up Ukraine, you know, to his desires. I don't think he thought it would take 3 years to get to this point. But I think he's been waiting for this time, and we're on the potential precipice that we may do so.
So Putin wins.
He wins, but he's extremely wounded. I mean, his society is wrecked to some degree. Their economic prospects are not great for the next generation at least, right? So again, but that also depends on what's the outcome of these negotiations and what's given and what's not given. And yeah, he may, you know, I think to some degree the best case scenario is that he gets to keep a fair bit of the territory, but Ukraine is allowed to continue to be part of the West and, you know, continually armed and defended. I mean, I think the length of time the Ukraine has to, if there's a pause and Ukraine's allowed to just continue to rearm and refurbish itself, it's actually in a better position. Like a large portion of how this war has gone on is that Ukraine is constantly fighting, constantly losing equipment, and can't fully modernize towards a Western standard of war. They're using a mishmash of old Soviet systems and new stuff. It's just not been very effective. And I think that if they are allowed to maintain their sovereignty and rearm and allowed to defend themselves, that you will see actually in some ways a much more effective Ukrainian military coming on their side. That's in some ways Putin's worst case scenario. And if that and I think that's what the Europeans would like to see as well. I think any effort to impinge on Ukraine's ability to govern is the way it wants its foreign relations is something that really scares Europe and scares Kyiv as well.
So is this the best that Ukraine and the West, NATO can get at this time?
No, if they keep fighting, there's some fairly credible signs that the Russian economy is not in great shape. That if you look at a lot of the arms that they're using, they are expending tens of thousands of men, not just from Russia now, but from South Korea and other, or sorry, North Korea and other countries to fight this war because they have real manpower issues. Their economy's overheating. They've completely remade it into a war economy, but now they're sending tanks from the 1950s to fight this war. There's not much beyond that. So I think that if we continue fighting, and we show that we will support Ukraine until this is done, I think we could do better. But I think that I think the Trump administration is wrongly made the identification that no, this, Russia's strong and we have to appease them. And I really just I
So,
think that that growth
so
was
let's
terrible.
do revisionist history. If Kamala Harris had won, the Democrats were in power, and you were the head of the armed forces in the United States. Is there a different strategy? What would it be?
Yeah, I would pull out the the strictures that have not allowed Ukraine to get munitions and other systems delivered and employed quickly. I'd pull those out. The Biden administration, when the history is written about this, people are going to look back at the Biden administration and going to see a dithering and a delays that really affected Ukraine's ability to fight this war. Uh, and had a lot of those been removed early on, maybe not early on, but after, let's say, first 5 or 6 months, if we had delivered long range, like the like ATACMs or some of these other systems that Ukraine's desperately asked for, I think that you'd basically see this conflict be significantly shorter. It'd be significantly worse for the Russians, and yet they failed to do so, and many European states failed to do so. So I think Kamala Harris was in. I think that had even the continuing of just some increase in support really would have made the point to Putin that you're going to keep having these unequal exchanges, and your political position is just going to get worse.
Richard Shimooka from Macdonald Law Institute. Really appreciate you coming on tonight and telling us a little bit about what's going on in Canada with the United States, our spending, what's going on in Ukraine, what you think the historical analogies are, and some of the weaknesses in what we're doing, and giving us some ideas of what we're up against. I really appreciate it. I'm going to take a break for some messages and come back with my own suggestions on what we need to do and do right away. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes.